start. Okay, welcome, Parshas Chukas Balak, but we're going to be doing a piece on Parshas Chukas today. I just want to speak about or thank the sponsors of the shiur. The shiur is sponsored today in the Schus of a Refuah Shlema for Sarah Gittel Bas Chaya Bracha, and also a Schus of a Refuah Shlema for Chava Fega Bas Henya. So they together with all of Klal Yisrael who needs Refuah Shlema, should have Refuah Shlema Ukreva, L'mayla Mederech HaTeva L'gamri. And it was also, this year was sponsored anonymously just to thank Hashem. So whoever did that, so beautiful. It was so beautiful to just thank Hashem. So thank you. Okay. So before I jump into the piece online, or pull up the actual piece, let me just give a little bit of an introduction to it. So this week, of course, is Parshas Chukas and Parshas Chukas Balak, and there's so much to speak about in both of these parshas. These are one of these parshas where I have to figure out what not to speak about, and even within the topics themselves, we could speak for months, give shiurim for months just on one of the topics, and including the one we're going to speak about today. So Parshas Chukas, we have the famous episode where Klal Yisrael doesn't have water, and Hashem tells Moshe Rabbeinu to take his staff and speak to the rock. And of course, we all know how the story ends. Moshe Rabbeinu hits the rock instead of speaking to the rock. And this is one of the, as the simple understanding is, one of the failings, if you will, of Moshe Rabbeinu, however we understand this. That Hashem is upset with him for seemingly for doing this. And the result of this is Hashem tells him that because you did not sanctify me in the eyes of Bnei Yisrael, that you will not be leading the Jewish people into the land of Eretz Yisrael. And we know because of this action, Moshe Rabbeinu, in fact, does not lead Klal Yisrael into Eretz Yisrael, which of course is his ultimate desire. This is what Moshe Rabbeinu has been working for and living for all these years. So obviously this whole episode really cries out, Darsheni, explain to me how we understand the various details. Now, there's lots of Meforshim that talk about, lots of commentaries that talk about exactly what Moshe Rabbeinu's quote unquote mistake was here. Rashi says it was hitting the rock instead of speaking to the rock, as many commentators say that as well. That seems to be an obvious sort of veering away from what Hashem told Moshe Rabbeinu. He told him, speak to the rock. Moshe Rabbeinu hits the rock. The Rambam says that it was because he got angry and he said, Shimu Nahamerim, listen now, O rebels. Moshe Rabbeinu gets upset with Klal Yisrael and calls them rebels. And the Rambam says that was why he doesn't go into Eretz Yisrael. It really seems like the punishment does not fit the crime. You know, the minor transgression of speaking to the rock instead of hitting the rock, it's for that, Moshe Rabbeinu doesn't go into Eretz Yisrael. And a lot of commentaries speak about this. I'm not even going to talk really about that topic today. Even though the piece that we're going to speak about asks this question, he doesn't even answer it in the actual piece. He answers it in another piece, and later on, there's various answers as to what the Mida Keneged Mida here is. It's not really our point today. What I want to talk about today is two questions. One is, why in fact did Moshe Rabbeinu not listen directly to Hashem? Why did he hit the rock? Hashem told him speak to the rock. Now, yes, everyone makes mistakes, but Moshe Rabbeinu is not everyone. We just learned a few parshas ago, he's Anav Mikol Adam, Apnei Adam, that he's the most humble human being who ever lived. And humble means he completely was able to subdue his own egocentric ideas, his own desires, and just give over Hashem's message to Klal Yisrael exactly as it was. He was a pure conduit for Hashem's message without mixing in any of his own messaging or his own desires, etc. In fact, this is one of the explanations of the Chet HaEgel, that when Moshe Rabbeinu was, when they felt that Moshe Rabbeinu was lost, when they counted the number of days that he was up on the mountain, and they counted, and according to their calculation, it was more than 40, and they felt Moshe Rabbeinu should have come down, and he hadn't come down, and they felt Moshe, and the Satan showed them a vision of Moshe Rabbeinu on his deathbed. When they felt Moshe Rabbeinu died on the mountain, this is again one of the explanations of the Chet Egel was that they felt that there's no human being who would be able to transmit the word of Hashem without mixing in their own ego, without mixing in their own messaging. How can we trust another human being, even the holy Aaron Cohen? But with Moshe Rabbeinu, they understood that he did not mix in any of his own of his own messaging or his own desires or his own words, etc. And that's why they said, let's make an inanimate object. According to one explanation, they weren't looking to replace Hashem; they were looking to replace Moshe Rabbeinu. And an inanimate object, if Hashem speaks through the inanimate object, we'll know for sure it's the words of Hashem. It's nobody else. It's no one else's messaging. It's nobody else's words. So in other words, everybody sort of understood, and the Torah certainly testifies to this, where Moshe Rabbeinu was Anu Mikol Adam, he was the most humble human being who ever lived, that Moshe Rabbeinu did not veer to the right or to the left or in any direction from exactly the direct words of Hashem. And yet here in our story, in Parshas Chukas, where Hashem tells him, speak to the rock, he hits the rock. And the question is why? And there's all kinds of different answers to this question. If you remember, in the end of Parshas Beshalach, very end of Parshas Beshalach, right before the war with Amalek, that's how Parshas Beshalach ends. There's another story there where Klal Yisrael did not have water. And Hashem tells Moshe Rabbeinu to take his staff. And there Hashem tells him to hit the rock. So many commentators say Hashem told him to hit the rock there. So Moshe Rabbeinu felt that it was okay to hit the rock. But that's a difficult explanation to really understand, because obviously Hashem told him there hit, and Hashem told him here say, speak to the rock. So that's really I think pushing the limits of understanding a little bit to say, well, because it was there Hashem told him to hit the rock, here he could hit the rock as well, even though Hashem told him to speak to the rock. No, that was not, Hashem told him here speak, and there he told him to hit. That was in the very beginning of the journey, the 40-year journey. Here we're at the very end of the 40-year journey. Klal Yisrael has developed. They've come to a much higher madrega. How do we understand? What was the reason why Moshe Rabbeinu veered from the message of Hashem? That's one question. The other question, which he speaks about here indirectly, or maybe actually directly towards the end of the piece, if we can get there, is, Moshe Rabbeinu, when this is all over, we see in Parshas V'eschanan that Moshe Rabbeinu begs Hashem to let him into the land, right? He's mispal, says Rashi, 515 times, and to such an extent that Hashem tells him, stop davening for this. Stop praying for this. This is my decree. You will not go into the land. But the obvious question here is, what is Moshe Rabbeinu, when Moshe Rabbeinu davens to Hashem, and in Parshas V'eschanan to go into the land, he's davening that Hashem annuls this decree. But why doesn't Moshe Rabbeinu ever do tshuva? Why doesn't he simply tell Hashem, because we don't see anywhere that Moshe Rabbeinu does that. He never tells Hashem, I'm sorry for what I did. I made a mistake. A whole vidui, a whole charata. We don't see any regret from Moshe Rabbeinu by doing this. He doesn't express that regret. Even when he's davening to Hashem, he's not davening that he regrets what he did. He's davening to Hashem to annul the decree. So why don't we see that Moshe Rabbeinu does tshuva on this act? So these are the questions that I have not found that a lot of commentators speak on. And I heard an explanation of this from the Lubavitcher Rebbe on Simchas Torah in 1981. It was Simchas Torah 1981, Simchas Torah, or it may have been actually 1980, Simchas Torah 1980, Tafshin Mem Aleph. So with Simchas Torah 1980, the Lubavitcher Rebbe spoke about this and gave an explanation. And I had not seen or heard any explanation like it until I actually learned this piece that we're about to do today. This piece again is from the sefer that we learned from a few weeks ago, the Eish Tamid, by Harav Druk. So this was a gift that was given to me, this set of svarim, and I'm making the most of this gift and learning from it and finding tremendous inspiration. And whenever I find something inspirational, I want to share it with you. So, and then the bigger question is, of course, in all of these episodes, why does the Torah record them? Because they're meant to be a lesson for us. So that's the underlying question behind all of this is, what do we learn from this story? Okay, so let's take a look at the piece. I'm going to pull it up online here. Oh, the Rebbe said the answer that we're going to see here in this piece. So it's very similar to what the Rebbe said. Okay, so let me share the screen so we could do this online. Those of you who are here in person, you have the, let me see, hold on one second. I want to see if I can see the waiting room. Here we go. That's what I needed to do. Because I have a problem that people come into the waiting room and I'm so intensely focused on this piece, I don't check back in the waiting room. But now I can look at the waiting room while we're doing this. Okay, perfect. Okay, so let's take a look at the piece here. Medua hika Moshe Rabbeinu al Sela v'lo divid alav kasher tziv Hashem. Why? The question he's going to deal with. Why did Moshe Rabbeinu, in fact, hit the rock and not speak to the rock, as Hashem said? So first he quotes the psukim. Ve'akilu Moshe v'Aaron esakal al pnei hasela. But this is after they're complaining. They have no water. They're dying of thirst. Moshe Rabbeinu and Aaron gathered all of Klal Yisrael to the Sela, to the rock. Vayomer lehem, and Moshe Rabbeinu gets angry and he says, Shimona hamayrim, which the Rambam says those words right there are his sin here in this story. Shimona hamayrim, listen now, rebels. Amina Sela hazed neitzilachamayim, from this rock should water ever come out, should water appear. Vayara Moshe es yadai, Moshe Rabbeinu lifted up his hand, vayach es hasela, and he hit the rock, the matehu, with his staff, almayim, twice. Vayetzumayim rabim, and a lot of water came out. The Teishta Eda Uviram, and everybody drank, and their flocks, their animals drank as well. Vayemer Hashem al Moshe vel Aaron, and Hashem responds to this whole episode by saying to Moshe and Aaron, Yan lehamantim bi lahaktisheni le'eni bnei Yisrael. You did not believe in me to sanctify me in the eyes of bnei Yisrael. Apparently, by speaking to the rock as opposed to hitting the rock, that would have added to the Kiddush Hashem. That would have added to the miracle. There's obviously, and the Meforshim explain what the difference is. Hitting the rock is also a miracle, right? None of us can hit a rock and bring out water. That is a miracle as well. But hitting the rock shows on a greater hishtadlus, and speaking to the rock on a much lesser effort. And the whole point was that Hashem wanted to imbue into Klal Yisrael at this point, when on the precipice of going into the land, that even though in the land they're going to have to exert effort, but ultimately the brachas come from Hashem. That was the idea that was meant to be imbued here, and somehow Moshe Rabbeinu exerting the effort and hitting the rock sort of transgresses that messaging, and therefore lechein, and therefore Hashem says, "Leit haviu es hakal el eretz el haaretz asher nasati lem." You will not be the ones who bring the Jewish people into the land. Vehema me Meriva asher rav bnei Yisrael as Hashem, and these were the waters of Meriva, the waters of rebellion that the Jewish people rebelled against Hashem. V'yikadosh. And that is the story, the psukim. So Rashi says, Yan lehamantim bi, you didn't cause Klal Yisrael to believe in me. Gila hakosov, and the pasuk reveals, says Rashi, she'aluli chet zeh bilvad, were it not for this one sin or this one mistake, hayu nichnas la'aretz, Moshe Rabbeinu and Aaron would have come into the land. Because of this, says Hashem, this is why they did not, implying that were it not for this, they absolutely would have. And the reason why Hashem wanted Moshe and Aaron to come into the land is so that everybody, the whole world, should look at them and say, the reason why Moshe and Aaron didn't come into the land was because they sinned in the same way as the rest of the Dora Midbar sinned. So Hashem did not want people to be able to say that, and therefore Hashem wanted Moshe and Aaron into the land. But this action of hitting the rock sort of negates that. Didn't Moshe Rabbeinu do worse mistakes than this? After all, Moshe Rabbeinu said in the story in Parshas, when Hashem told Moshe Rabbeinu that he's going to. This is when they're hungry and they desire the meat that they had in Mitzrayim. They're tired of the man, and Hashem tells Moshe Rabbeinu, okay, he's going to send meat to feed them all. Moshe Rabbeinu questions, even if we would shecht all the animals we have, it's not enough to feed them all. So how? That isn't that questioning of Hashem worse than hitting the rock here? But there he did it just privately between him and Hashem. So since it was done privately, Hashem had mercy on him and therefore did not count that as a mistake to prevent him from going into the land. But here, Vakan, where he hits the rock, here it's in front of everybody. It's a public sort of transgressing the word of Hashem. Therefore, because of Kiddush Hashem, Hashem did not have that same level of Rahmanas. Here it was done publicly, and that's how Rashi explains. Okay, let's take a look at the Eish Tamid. How does Rabbi Druk explain this story? So it's clear that it was simply only because of this mistake of hitting the rock that Moshe Rabbeinu is not allowed to go into the land. This seems to be the only reason. But Tzarech Lahavin, he says, what's the connection? What's the connection between the sin and the punishment? Why? Because of hitting the rock, specifically, he gets this punishment of not being able to go into land. Where's the Mida Keneged Mida? Right? Where's the scale of justice here? Seems to be a small transgression and a huge punishment. The Baal HaTurim and the Baal HaTurim writes, L'chein is the same gematria as Mida B'Mida, which is measure for measure. But Tzarech Bir Davar Zet, Kate said, Yesh Ba'inish Zeh Mida B'Mida. Where do we see the Mida B'Mida? Now, what's interesting is Rabbi Druk does not answer this question in this piece. So I actually looked later on, and he does answer it in a whole other piece with a whole other lengthy explanation, which is beyond our purvey in this year. So this is a fair question. This punishment seems to be extremely severe. That he doesn't enter the land. This was his whole dream. This it's well known. How much Moshe Rabbeinu desired. This was his whole desire to come into the land. But Kama his pala lifnei HaKadosh Baruch Hu, and how much he davened in Parshas. We know how much he davened. That he should be zeicha to come into the land. Until Hashem tells him in Veschanan, I'll taste of David Alai. Stop speaking. Stop davening to me about this. Hashem tells him. So from this, it's understood. There's something here that weighs heavily about Moshe Rabbeinu hitting the rock. So if this mistake was so egregious and so heavy that it was the equivalent of not being able to go into the land, that this was the punishment, why does Moshe Rabbeinu never do tshuva? He only davens that Hashem should annul that decree that he's not allowed to go into the land. He never does vidu. He never confesses that he did anything wrong. And he never says Hashem, I made a mistake. I'm sorry. I apologize. I take it back. I have regret. He doesn't say any of those words. Why not? If the sin is so heavy, why does Moshe Rabbeinu not do tshuva? After all, don't we know Ein Davar Omed Lifnei Tshuva? That if a person does tshuva, he's forgiven. So l'cheira, if Moshe Rabbeinu had done tshuva, he maybe would have been able to go into the land. And yet even knowing this, he davens only for bittul gezerah. He never davens, or he never asks, or he never expresses any level of tshuva. But tzarech bir, why not? Is the question. Why? How do we understand this? Okay. And Harav Druk gives such a beautiful explanation. I've only heard this one other time by the Lubavitch Rebbe in that Simchas Torah in 1980. And the Lubavitch Rebbe said it in the context of he taught a niggin to the words of Aha Selahach, to the words of Moshe Rabbeinu hitting the rock. And there's a whole niggin in Lubavitch ever since then that we sing this every Simchas Torah. And the Rebbe said, L'cheira, it seems bizarre to be singing on Simchas Torah about a quote-unquote failure of Moshe Rabbeinu hitting the rock. Why are we making a niggun, a song, which is joyous, about the one failure of Moshe Rabbeinu where he hit the rock? It doesn't seem to be congruous with Simchas Torah and with making a song about it. Okay, so let's take a look at how, and the Rebbe gave an answer, and that answer is going to be what Rav Druk says here in this piece. So let's take a look. Vehine b'tfilas geshem anu oimrim. So on Shmini Atzeres, on the Musaf of Shmini Atzeres, we have a tefillah of geshem, a tefillah of rain, where we daven for rain, right? This is where we start saying, we switch over from Mori to Tal that we say in the summer months, and then in the winter months we begin saying Masha Baruch and Mori to Geshem. And to introduce that on Shmini Atzeres and Musaf, we have a tefillah of Geshem. And there's various paragraphs in this little tefillah, in this small tefillah, but one of those paragraphs is fascinating. He says, and he quotes one of the paragraphs that we say in Tefillas Geshem. And the paragraph is as follows. Zachor masu b'tevas guma min hamayim. We're asking Hashem in this tefillah of Geshem to remember, to recall certain meritorious acts, that in that merit Hashem should not withhold the rain from us. Okay, so one of these meritorious acts is remember Moshe Rabbeinu. Zachor masu b'teva guma min hamayim. Remember the one who was drawn from the Teva's Guma, from the wicker basket from the water, meaning Moshe Rabbeinu. And not only that was he drawn from the water, but Moshe Rabbeinu actually drew water for Klal Yisrael. And he gave waters to their sheep, to their animals. Segulecha, and your nation, that your beloved nation. Segulecha means your beloved. Your Segula. Your beloved nation. When they were thirsty for water, Moshe Rabbeinu hit the rock, and gave them water. And therefore we daven b'tzidkoi, in his merit, in his righteousness, don't withhold water from us. That's the tefillah in Geshem. So now the obvious question is, we're trying to recall a merit of Moshe. It's such a fantastic question. And again, this is why I love learning, because I don't have the wherewithal myself to be able to ask these, to think of these questions. So the Gedalim, the great rabbis, teach us these questions. And then once I hear the question, I'm like, yes, that is a great, why did I never ask that question? That's a great question. Here we're trying to recall in the Tefillah of Geshem, we're recalling the schusim of we're asking Hashem, recall the meritorious acts of the past involving water, and therefore don't withhold water, give us rain. And what do we say? What's the meritorious act? That when we were thirsty, Moshe Rabbeinu hit the rock. 1 second, that's not a meritorious act. That's the one sin of Moshe Rabbeinu, that before that sin, he doesn't go into the land. Isn't that how we always understood it? Is it possible that maybe we always understood this story incorrectly? And that clearly the fact that we say this in Tefillas Geshem may be far from being a sin. Maybe this was an act of righteousness. As we say, B'tzidkoi, in his tzidkus, in his righteousness, don't hold back water from us. V'kvar niskashu Rabbi. And many people have asked this question, says Rav Druk. Apparently Rabbi Simon wasn't one of them. V'kvar niskashu Rabbi. Many people ask this question. We're mentioning in this tefillah, we're mentioning various episodes that are trying to arouse merit, so that the rain should come for a blessing, and we shouldn't experience drought, or we shouldn't experience flooding. The rain should be a bracha. So we're trying to arouse merit. So why are we mentioning the sin of Moshe Rabbeinu? That seems to be the opposite of a merit. We should have covered over that sin. We should have concealed it. And certainly not to mention it and to request on behalf of that act of Moshe Rabbeinu, please don't withhold water from us. The implication in Tefillas Geshem is that this was a merit that Moshe Rabbeinu, this was an act of righteousness that Moshe Rabbeinu. How do we understand that? And this goes along with what the Rebbe was saying. And we're making a song and we're singing about this on Simchas Torah. It doesn't make sense to sing about a sin unless we can understand the story in a completely different way. And again, this is why I love learning, because it's when you see Torah through the eyes of Gedalim, it opens up a whole new window of understanding of parts of Torah that we've been learning for our whole lives or for however many years. And he says, so too we have to ask, Mahu in his righteousness don't withhold water from us. What? There's no righteousness here based on how we simply understand the story. How in the Tefillah of Geshem, we seem to be completely transforming this act from a mistake of Moshe Rabbeinu, from a sin of Moshe Rabbeinu, to an act of tzedek, to an act of righteousness. How is that? So then he says, there are some who explain this because this seems to be completely contradiction. Tefillas Geshem is calling it an act of righteousness, and the Torah clearly seems to be saying it's a mistake that Moshe Rabbeinu was punished for. So there's some who want to answer this by saying Tefillas Geshem is not talking about this episode in Parshas Chukas. It's talking about the episode where Hashem told him to hit the rock in Parshas Beshalach. There, if you look in Parshas Beshalach, again, at the very end, the last aliyah in Parshas Beshalach, right before the war with Amalek, the same similar story. Jewish people are thirsty. They're complaining. Hashem tells him, hit the rock. There, Hashem tells him to hit the rock. He does hit the rock. He brings forth water. So the simple explanation of this sort of discrepancy between Tefillas Geshem and Parshas Chukas is that Tefillas Geshem isn't speaking about Parshas Chukas. It's speaking about Parshas Beshalach. He says so that the emes, that the Eina Kavana be'emes lahakosa shamoshe b'sela ksuba Parshasenu shenachshav l'lechet, that the Torah, that the Tefillas Geshem is not talking about, in fact, Parshas Chukas, where that was a mistake, el lahakah harishona. But the first time Moshe Rabbeinu hit the rock, but Tefillas Arba'im Shana, in the beginning of this desert journey, the beginning of the 40-year journey, that was the end of Parshas Beshalach. Asher Sham Nitztavu came b'mafurish. There, Hashem told him explicitly to hit the rock. There he quotes the psukim. Vayomer Moshe la'am. Moshe says to the people, Avur lifnei ha'am v'kach itcha mizikne. Hashem tells Moshe Rabbeinu to go before the people. V'kach itcha mizikne Yisrael. Take with you the elders of the Jewish people. Matcha, take with you your staff. Asher atisa b'yasayor, that you hit the Nile with. Kach biyadka v'halachta. Take it in your hand and go to the rock. And he stands there before the tzur b'cherev, the hakisa b'tzur, and he hits the tzur. He hits the rock. The yatzum memenu mayim, and water came out. The shasa am, and the people were able to drink. This is what Hashem's telling Moshe: he hit the rock, and the people were able to drink. V'yas kain Moshe le'eni ziknesa, and Moshe Rabbeinu does that. V'im kain hakazu she'asa b'Moshe Rabbeinu. Therefore, that hitting of the rock in Parshas Beshalach, that was the Ratzon Hashem Yisborach. Hashem told him, hit the rock. And then Moshe did what Hashem told him to do. So therefore, Anu Maskirim b'Tefillas Geshem Avakshim Avudamayim. And therefore, we mention it Tefillas Geshem because this was a miracle that Moshe Rabbeinu did, revolving around water. So in the merit of that miracle of feeding Klal Yisrael water or giving Klal Yisrael a drink from the rock, we mention this in Tefillas Geshem. That's what some people say. But says Rav Druk, that's not sufficient. Not a sufficient answer. And he says, I'll tell you why clearly. Because in Tefillas Geshem, it says, V'yach es ha-sela. He hit the sela. In Beshalach, it calls it a tzur, not a sela. And a tzur and a sela, even though they're both translated as rocks, are two totally different kinds of rocks. So, and he says this, Ela shetiret zeh kasha lahem. He says, this teretz isn't sufficient. Hisham loy muska klav b'lashon sela. In parts of the Beshalach, it never speaks about a sela. Rak b'lashon tzur. It calls the rock a tzur. The ilu b'fiut muskar, but in our piyut of in Tefillas Geshem, what does it say? Aha sela hach. He hit the sela. The yatsumayim, and water came out. The sela is what it's referred to in Parshas Chukas. So the fact that it uses the word sela in Tefillas Geshem implies it is in fact talking about the story in Parshas Chukas. Im kain mashma shekavanas hapaiton. It seems that the intention of the author of the of the poem that we read in Tfilas Geshem, was not the first hitting the rock, but it seems like his intent was in fact the second hitting of the rock. And that second hitting was considered like a sin to Moshe Rabbeinu, to the extent that Hashem doesn't let him into the land. So then we're back to our original question. If it's talking about the story in Parshas Chukas, how is it calling it? Why are we recalling this? Why are we calling it an act of righteousness? Why are we saying in the merit of that, don't withhold rain from us? The ain kavanase lakad rishona is clearly the fact that he uses the word sela. His intention is not talking about the story in Parshas B'Shalach. Being kain tzarich biur. Then we're back to our original question. Should nikra ma'aseh shel tzedek? We're calling this tzibit tzidkoi, in his righteousness. Don't hold back water from us. We mentioned this as some kind of praise of Moshe Rabbeinu, and because of that praise, we're requesting water from Hashem. How do we understand this? So let's take a look at what he says. Ubir Avi Marizal. He quotes from his father. Rav Druk quotes from his father. He's an explanation from his father. And again, the Lubavitcher Rebbe gives the very, very similar explanation. Beautiful explanation, completely turning the story on its head. And I love whenever I learn these kinds of pieces, that I've learned the Torah one way for I don't know how many, 35, 40 years, whatever it may be. And all of a sudden I have a completely new way of looking at Torah. It just shows the beauty of Torah and how the Torah could be interpreted on so many different levels. Okay, so let's get ready to understand this story in a completely different fashion, and then most importantly, what we can learn from it ourselves. Okay. The reason why Hashem wanted Moshe Rabbeinu to hit the rock, to speak to the rock, and not to hit the rock, mefurish b'kasu. The pasuk tells us clearly why Hashem wanted him to speak to the rock. Hashem tells Moshe Rabbeinu when he's upset that he hit the rock, Yan lehamantim, you didn't cause them to believe in me. This somehow would have been a much bigger Kiddush Hashem. It would have imbued Emunah into Klal Yisrael. So how would speaking of the rock have done that? So Perush Rashi explains. Rashi says, "Lati sheni." What does it mean to sanctify me? Sheilu debartim el haitzi. If Moshe Rabbeinu would have spoken to the rock, and the rock would have emitted water just from his speaking, I would have been sanctified, says Hashem, in the eyes of the congregation, because they would have said to themselves, "How can we rebel against Hashem? How can we question Hashem? This rock that has no faculties of intellect, that doesn't speak, and that cannot even physically hear, it's an inanimate object. And the rock doesn't have to depend upon Hashem for parnasa. The rock doesn't hear. The rock doesn't see. The rock's not dependent upon Hashem. And yet, nevertheless, Moshe Rabbeinu speaks to the rock, and the rock listens to Hashem's words. How much more so we, human beings, who can hear Hashem's words, who can see the miracles that He's done, who are dependent upon Hashem for our life force, for our vitality, for our parnasa. If the rock listens to Hashem, how much more we should listen to Hashem. That's what Hashem wanted. Hashem wanted Klal Yisrael to make that calculation, and that would have imbued Emunah into the Jewish people. That if the rock listens to the word of Hashem, how much more we should listen to the word of Hashem. Obviously, Moshe Rabbeinu hits the rock, that takes away the Kal V'chomer. That takes away that logical inference. So that's what Hashem wanted. That's why Hashem was upset with Moshe Rabbeinu. Seemingly. Moshe Rabbeinu. So why didn't Moshe? So again, Moshe Rabbeinu was Anav Mikol Adam. He was completely humble. He didn't mix in his own messaging in Hashem's words, as we said in the beginning of the shiur. So why didn't Moshe Rabbeinu listen to that? That makes perfect sense. That Kal V'chomer, that logical inference that they would have been able to apply to themselves. It would have imbued the Emunah and better behavior control in themselves. So why not listen to exactly and explicitly to Hashem's instruction? Why did Moshe Rabbeinu? What was this a mistake? Was this a moment of anger, as the Rambam says, as other commentators say? What if we can interpret this story that Moshe Rabbeinu knew exactly what he was doing? He didn't act out of anger. He hit the rock intentionally and on purpose, even though Hashem told him speak to the rock. And even though Hashem had a very good reason, as we just said, Klal Yisrael would have been imbued with the emunah of that the rock listens to Hashem, how much more we should. Even knowing all of that, Moshe Rabbeinu intentionally and specifically knew exactly what he was doing and had a reason why he hit the rock instead of speaking to the rock. What if that's the actual answer? What could that answer be? Why would Moshe Rabbeinu want to do that? Let's take a look. Exactly like breaking the luchos. Exactly. Let's take a look in his holy words here. Moshe Rabbeinu yada. Moshe Rabbeinu knew. Sha'asidim b'nei Yisrael l'chata. That Klal Yisrael would sin in the future. That they, in fact, would not always listen to Hashem. There would come times when they were not listening to the words of Hashem. And if that's the case, there would have been an incredible prosecuting force against Klal Yisrael. The Malachim, the prosecuting angels that we spoke about a few weeks ago, that we create with our Dibur, that the prosecuting forces, the spiritual forces, would have had an incredible taina and a complaint against the Jewish people. Exactly what Hashem's logical inference was. Moshe Rabbeinu didn't want that logical inference to be made, because had it been made, it would have left Klal Yisrael open for real prosecution. Even a rock listens to the words of Hashem. How could Klal Yisrael not listen to the words of Hashem? Moshe Rabbeinu didn't want that to be able to be said as a prosecution against the Jewish people. It's true, but a rock doesn't have free choice. But the point is, symbolically, a rock can't emit water. Symbolically, the point is, the rock listens to Hashem. The rock has no ear, no intellect, no insight, no dependency on Hashem. And yet the inanimate rock listens to Hashem, and Klal Yisrael does not. To prevent that prosecution against Klal Yisrael, Lakach Hayakum Moshe Rabbeinu al Hasela. Therefore, Moshe Rabbeinu specifically hit the rock. V'lei diber alav. Moshe Rabbeinu, to transgress the word of Hashem, had to be the greatest level of sacrifice, even knowing what would come as a result of this, possibly not being able to enter the land. But Moshe Rabbeinu was willing to sacrifice everything that there shouldn't be aroused a prosecution, a kitrug on Klal Yisrael, but in an instance where they do not in the future listen to the words of Hashem. Moshe Rabbeinu was protecting the Jewish people. And this is exactly what Rachel just said before. This was the story of the Luchos. When Hashem tells Moshe Rabbeinu by the Cheta Ego, by the sin of the golden calf, go down, your people are rebelling. Moshe Rabbeinu goes down and he's holding these pristine luchos, these tablets, the tablets of the 10 Commandments that were the Maaseh Hashem, that were the work of Hashem, that were the handiwork of Hashem. These tablets this is what Moshe Rabbeinu stood on the mountain for 40 days and 40 nights. He received these miraculous tablets filled with all kinds of spirituality and godliness. And Moshe Rabbeinu sees what Klal Yisrael is doing, and he knows that he comes down with these tablets. And he tells them that the word of Hashem is not to worship idols, the second commandment. That Klal Yisrael would be obligated in that. The Gemara gives an example of a man who comes down and he sees his wife commits an affair right before the marriage. He tears up the ksuva not to ensure she's an Ashes Ish, so she shouldn't be punished as a married woman. Similarly, Moshe Rabbeinu shatters the luchos. We can only imagine the level of self-sacrifice that it took for Moshe Rabbeinu to shatter the luchos. Torah was Moshe Rabbeinu's life. To such an extent, it's called Torah's Moshe. This was his entire life. Every breath of his existence was transmitting Torah. And yet he shatters the Torah to spare Klal Yisrael from being punished in a harsher manner. He sacrifices himself on behalf of the cloth. And here we see he does it again. This is the theme of Moshe Rabbeinu's life. It's not the only time we see it. We see it in the story of saving the Jew from being beaten by the Mitzri. He sacrifices his life to save the life of another. He sacrifices his desires, his wishes, his whole mitzias, his whole existence in shattering the Torah. And here again, by the story of the rock, it wasn't that he made a mistake. It wasn't that he acted out of anger. Is that he knew exactly what he was doing to spare Klal Yisrael, the Kitrug, exactly the same reason why he shattered the Luchos. And in fact, if you look at the very end of the Torah, Zois HaBracha, the last words of the Torah, it says, it speaks about the wonders, the glorious miracles that Moshe Rabbeinu did, le'enei Klal Yisrael. And that's how the Torah ends, le'enei Klal Yisrael, in front of the eyes of the Jewish people. Says Rashi, what miracle are we praising Moshe Rabbeinu for here? This breaking of the Luchos. Moshe Rabbeinu is praised at the very end of the Torah. In fact, the last words of the Torah, praised for breaking the Luchos. Why? What's the praise for exactly this? He broke the Luchos, sacrificing himself, sacrificing his whole desire for Torah on behalf of Klal Yisrael, not to arouse a greater prosecution. And so the same thing here, Umamela, therefore he continues top of the page, Mavur, and therefore we can understand in Tfilas Geshem what we're saying. In his righteousness, don't withhold water from us. This was an act of incredible self-sacrifice. Incredible self-sacrifice that Moshe Rabbeinu perhaps knew he would not be going into the land. And even when Hashem tells him, you are not going into the land, he never once does tshuva because he doesn't regret the act. Tshuva necessitates regret for the act. He doesn't regret the act. Notwithstanding the ultimate punishment, if you will, of not being able to go into the land. This was an act of incredible sacrifice, of righteousness, of self-sacrifice of Moshe Rabbeinu over Klal Yisrael on behalf of the Jewish people. What an unbelievable way to turn this story and see the story through these lenses. The story is not teaching us a failing of Moshe Rabbeinu, as we always learn, the one mistake of Moshe Rabbeinu. It's telling us, in fact, the incredible righteousness. So then why can't he go into the land? He explains in another piece why Moshe Rabbeinu, this story made it clear Moshe Rabbeinu wasn't the right leader to bring them into the land. But it's beyond the what we have time for here. But we look at the story now. This was done not as an act of anger, not as a mistake, but it was it was in order to prevent this powerful prosecuting force to be able to say, even the rock listens to the word of Hashem, Klal Yisrael does not. To prevent that from being said, Moshe Rabbeinu was willing to sacrifice everything. And therefore we, who are the Talmidim of Moshe Rabbeinu, we look to our Rabbi, Moshe Rabbeinu, we look to our ultimate teacher as the ultimate example of self-sacrifice, Avarenu, on our behalfs. We ask Hashem for water, we arouse that level of self-sacrifice. This was an act of incredible self-sacrifice to Moshe Rabbeinu. And this is what the Rebbe explained also. This is why the Rebbe said, I'm teaching this niggun and we're singing this song on Simchas Torah. This isn't a failing of Moshe Rabbeinu. This was, in fact, the epitome of what a Jewish leader is all about. What it means to be a leader of Jews. And by the way, leader doesn't mean the leader of the generation or even the leader of a congregation around, where each one of us are leaders in our own homes and in our own communities. We're leaders to our children and to our grandchildren, to those we have influence on. And the Zohar says that each and every one of us has a nitzutz of Moshe Rabbeinu within us. Every one of us has a spark of Moshe Rabbeinu's neshama within us. And the fact that Moshe Rabbeinu has this, had this level of self-sacrifice empowers that spark within us. Empowers us to bring out this level of self-sacrifice within ourselves. So many of us look at life through the lenses of what do I get from this relationship? What do I get from this synagogue? What do I get from this rabbi? What do I get from this marriage? What do I get from this friendship? That's our nature. Moshe Rabbeinu looked at what can I give to Klal Yisrael, even if it meant the ultimate giving of not being able to go into the land. And it teaches us to have a paradigm shift of how we look at life, transcend our egocentric nature, and not think, what do I get out of this? But what can I give to this relationship? What can I give? Why are the words of John Kennedy, ask not what your country can do for you? Why is that? If you would ask somebody in the street, name me a famous phrase by a president, name me 3 famous phrases by a president. What would you say? Right? Everybody would say that. Why is that so embedded in our minds, that phrase of John Kennedy? Because it epitomizes self-sacrifice, which we ultimately understand intellectually. We understand, even if we're not holding by that on a personal level, we intellectually understand what an amazing madrega that is. To be able, an amazing level that is, to be able to subdue my own egocentric wants, desires, yearnings, and sacrifice for something larger than myself. Such a powerful way of looking at this story, and such a powerful lesson here embedded in Parshas Chukas that we never knew until we learned the Eish Tamid, or we heard that Sikha from the Rabbi. This is how the Gedalim look at Torah, just through just different lenses, and this is why we always have to keep learning. And now we understand our first question. Why does Moshe Rabbeinu never do tshuva on this story? Why does he never have regret? You know why? Because he doesn't regret it. Because regretting it will annul the action, right? When we do tshuva on something, right? Real tshuva. Right? Let's say, God forbid, a person does a sin, and then he has absolute tshuva, real charata, real regret. Real tshuva erases the action, right? And again, if it's a sin against another human being, you have to go to that human being, and you have to apologize to that human being. But whatever it may be, the steps of tshuva annul the action. And this is exactly, Moshe Rabbeinu didn't do tshuva because he didn't want to annul the action, because annulling the action would then arouse that prosecution against Klal Yisrael. So this answers an obvious question that I never asked until I saw this speak. Why did Moshe, if it's a mistake, if it's a sin, if he wants to go into Eretz Yisrael so bad, do tshuva, express regret. He never once does. Because what is tshuva? Tshuva means regretting the action. If Moshe Rabbeinu would regret it, it would be completely erased. But if that's completely erased, then the prosecution would come back. That even a rock would have listened to Hashem, but Klal Yisrael does not. And in order not to arouse this prosecution, he sacrifices himself, the ultimate sacrifice. And even afterwards, after Hashem tells him, you're not going into the land, and there's no 2 ways about it, you're not going in, he does not do tshuva. He never regrets this sin. This is the ultimate sacrifice of a leader on behalf of his nation. And it's such a powerful lesson for us on that. And this is what Torah is not just meant to be a book of stories that happened in our past. And when we learn, we're not only simply meant to translate and understand the stories, we are, but there's another level, and that is, how do they then speak to me? That's what we're meant to ask ourselves in every episode that we learn in Torah. What does this mean for me? And I think the message, when we look at this through these lenses, the lenses of the Rebbe, the lenses of Harav Druk, we look at this story, we learn about what it means to experience and to live real sacrifice, real Avos Yisrael on behalf of others, even if it means losing something that is your ultimate desire, your wishes, your will, for something that is larger than you. And again, lahavdil, this is exactly what Kennedy's message was. Don't ask what your country can do for you. Ask what you, as a human being, can do for something bigger than yourself. And we all understood, and this stands time immemorial as one of the great phrases that ever mentioned in a presidential address, because we understand the greatness of what self-sacrifice is. And this is the irony of life, that so many of us are searching for happiness and looking for happiness. And the irony of happiness is that the more I search and look and try to find my own happiness, the more it eludes me, and the harder it is to find. But the more I spend my time searching for other people's happinesses, the more I'm willing to sacrifice myself on behalf of others. It's there where I could find real happiness and real joy. That's the lesson of Parshas Chukas. Powerful, powerful lesson. Perhaps the reason why we always read Parshas Chukas before we go into the 3-week period where we're mourning where we begin Yud Zayin Tammuz, Shiva Tammuz to Tisha B'Av. We're mourning the Churban of the Beis Hamikdash. And we know that the whole Churban of the second Beis Hamikdash was because of Sinas Chinam, because of baseless hatred of one Jew to another, because of selfishness of the Jewish people at that time. Parshas Chukas teaches us the lesson of the ultimate selflessness. Thank you so much, everybody. Have a wonderful week. And Amir Tzashem, we should all view this lesson of the selflessness, the sacrifice of Moshe Rabbeinu into our own lives and into our own relationships. Thank you so much, everybody.
Thank you, Rabbi Simon.
Thank you, Rabbi.
Should be a schus for a refuah shlema for all those who need a refuah shlema. Amen.
Amen.
Life
Thank you,
change.
everyone.
Say we go into the 3 weeks on this because Moshe Rabbeinu not going into Eretz Yisrael allowed the Beis Hamikdash to be destroyed and us not to be
It's also
destroyed.
very true.
But
Yeah.
one question that I just had: do you
Yes.
think that it's mutually exclusive that Moshe Rabbeinu sacrifices himself and doesn't go into Eretz Yisrael and still doesn't regret? You're saying so he sacrifices himself and therefore he can't go in, and maybe his punishment for not doing exactly what Hashem said was Olam Hazeh, but his reward it still could be Olam
For
Haba
sure.
because
That's
it was
for
the
sure.
correct thing to
That's
do,
for sure.
right? It's not a contradiction.
That's for sure. And
to do the right thing.
That's
but
absolutely.
still not follow the word of Hashem. I mean, look, there wasn't the direct word of Hashem vis-a-vis the luchos exactly,
Right,
to
right,
break or not to
right,
break.
right.
Here there was the word of
Right,
Hashem, and he
right,
did follow exactly.
right.
But I'm saying, right, you could still do the wrong thing according to the letter of the law, and it still be the correct
Absolutely,
thing for your
absolutely,
nation.
100%. And in fact, he says later on in a different piece, it's not as a punishment. It ends up, it's not how he explains it. It's not a punishment; that it's just a consequence of the action. And he explained because the again, this is he gives a whole lengthy piece, and it deserves much more than a 30-second explanation. But basically, the previous generation of the Midbar, the early generation, the beginning of the Midbar in Parshas B'Shalach, they're coming from slavery, and that's what they understood. They understood hitting. That was the language they understood. What Hashem was bringing them to was a higher state of consciousness, and they had to live with real emunah, that even though they're going into the land and it's going to necessitate their hishtadlus, their work and their effort and plowing and sowing and reaping, etc., but they should recognize it's not their hishtadlus that brings the bracha. It's not the hitting that brings the water. It's simply the word of Hashem. And so by Moshe Rabbeinu hitting it, even though it was for a good reason and for a good cause and for the sacrifices on behalf of Klal Yisrael, the lesson itself, the land itself, Eretz Yisrael, necessitates a higher level of emunah that wasn't brought into Klal Yisrael through this act. Again, he explains it on a much deeper level. It's not as a punishment, but yes, it's exactly as you said. This was because the real question is, well, if Hashem was upset, if this was a mistake, why did it produce water? Right? Why not Hashem just not have it just be like a regular rock? Clearly a miracle happened. Hashem allowed the miracle to happen, right? It did produce water. So clearly there was some level of agreement on Hashem's part that this was an action that Hashem understood. It produced a miracle. So why did it even produce a miracle if it was a mistake? That's the answer, that at this level, it was not a mistake. It was the right thing to do for that leader, for Moshe Rabbeinu, but to get into the land, Klal Yisrael needed a different form of leadership. So
And Aharon was part of this.
he was
and
part
then
of this,
I'm
yeah.
saying
Because again, Aaron,
still suffered the consequence, so to say.
this was also, he explains this also, that this was Aaron's created the egel and cheta egel again because he felt that there would be without this egel, they would completely dissolve and there would completely be a lack of emunah. And this was trying to keep the emunah in Klal Yisrael. But again, it was an act of greater hishtadlus than Hashem wanted. Hashem wanted them to rely on their own emunah. So it's a much bigger piece from Rav Druk in the Sefer that follows this, where he answers that question. But yeah, these are all fair questions. Yes, you had a question? Oh, yeah.
I know the first time
Hashem did tell him the rock, do you think maybe he thought that Hashem really meant to again? Even though
There's some Meforshim who say that. There's some Meforshim who say exactly that. Some commentators say he saw Hashem told him to hit the rock here, so hitting the rock obviously wasn't a wrong thing.
Right.
So yeah, there are some who say that. Yes, Robert.
Often talk about the inflation of ego, you know, that we're supposed to be suppressing. But we don't want any leader to be so big that they kind of outshine Hashem, or, you know, so we don't want people to look at leaders and think that they are all that, so to speak. So Moshe got him out of Mitzrayim, and he brought him into Midbar, but we're not going to let him, you know, take it all the way. And there are so many other interesting historical contrasts. I mean, Winston Churchill did amazing things in World War II Britain, and he ran for re-election and he lost. FDR did an amazing thing during World War II. But
You know,
he didn't live.
There's a lot of wisdom to
what.
there's a lot of wisdom to what you're saying. In fact, this is one of the reasons given why we don't know where the burial place of Moshe Rabbeinu is, because Hashem didn't want it to become a source of idolatry for people. Yeah, there's a lot of wisdom in what you're saying there. That is spoken about, and maybe one of the reasons why, if you look in the entire Haggadah, where we speak about the story of Yetzias Mitzrayim, Moshe Rabbeinu is hardly mentioned at all. In the whole, and when we repeat the story every single year in the Haggadah on Pesach, I think Moshe Rabbeinu's name is mentioned once in the Haggadah, and it's at the very end where it says Vayiminu b'Hashem and Moshe Avdoi, where they believed in Hashem and Moshe's servant, when we're saying the Psukim of Hallel. So yeah, there's a lot of wisdom in that. Yeah. Okay. Thank you so much, everybody. We'll see everybody next week in Mitzvah. Thank you so much, everybody, for joining me online. And we'll see everybody next week in Mitzvah Hashem.